Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is a very interesting and very important series of discussions that is going to come on the People's Liberation Army. Not the one that did the ambush in Manipur, but the original one from China. We've done, myself along with General Ravi Shankar, who's here with me. Sir, thank you first and foremost for taking us through the story of China. In the first three series of episodes that we did, we talked about the Chinese demographics, we talked about the Chinese economy, and of course, the big man himself, Xi Jinping. We discussed how these things are going to go forward. This is the part two, which will have a couple of segments in terms of couple of videos where we discuss and try and understand who our adversary is, the People's Liberation Army of China. Thank you, sir, for joining me. And, for this very in-depth analysis that we've planned for our viewers about this entity that a lot of us might not understand.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Aadi. Thanks for calling me over for this discussion on PLA once again. It's very important that we understand our competitor or adversary, whomever you want, whichever way you want to call it. But the way the Chief of Defense Staff put it, our threat is from China. So we need to understand China and its army better, and its leaders. Because if you understand them well, then everything else falls into place. Then, of course, sometimes we can do things, and how does the terrain work in him? In the Indo-Sino-Indian context, we could discuss that.
Absolutely, sir. So I'd like to just say a couple of things before we jump into questions. The PLA, as we all know, is as a changed army. This is not what we saw during the days of Mao. And, the current leader, Xi Jinping, wants to make it a modernized army by 2050, a world-class status by 2035. And this is something that has been put across by them very clearly. Their priorities have changed, their ways of work have changed, and their purpose is different from what it was before. A lot of what we see today is glitz and glamour, which has been put out by the propaganda mouthpieces of China. And do we really know? That's something that I ask myself, how this organization actually functions. How do they take their decisions? What is the chain of command? And so on and so forth. Democratic armies are very public in terms of making sure that their countrymen are aware how their armies work. That's not the case probably with the Chinese. I will be showing a couple of slides here right at the beginning to tell us the size of the force. And let me put it across right at the beginning that this discussion is not going to be on comparing the numbers, because those can be deceiving, and those are just one factor of the army, and that's what I feel. General would be welcome to correct me if he feels differently. We need to understand who the PLA is, how they fight, what can they use to fight against us, and of course, as I said earlier, who takes the calls to fight. Till now, there was a lot of discussion with regards to who initiated the entire conflict between India and China. Recently, some news came out that this was being directed by the president himself. So there is a lot that we don't know, and there's a lot that we need to learn. My first question to you, sir. The PLA, since its history, has been known as a poor army. The Chinese were never a rich nation. This is probably the first time in their history that they've become rich. Whatever you might like to term it as. Their strategies till the late 60s and 70s were based on human wave attacks. They would come in thousands and thousands. And yesterday was the Battle of Rizangla Memorial that was done. And one of the tactics they tried to use there as well. What are the factors that you would like to highlight that made them change their strategy to what it is today? And have they been successful?
Important question, because we have to understand the PLA in the right context. First, the PLA is a party's army. It's the People's Liberation Army, is the army of the Communist Party of China, and it is not a national army. That's the first thing. The second thing is the PLA, which is what you see today, is far different from the PLA what it was. Okay. Now, this change is guided by three factors broadly. One, is the historical evolution of the People's Republic of China. We'll discuss that. Second, the changing threat perceptions of China. And the third factor is the economics of China. So we'll take each of them one by one. Then we'll see the rest, because understanding this is very important. When you look at the evolutionary historic evolution, the PLA started as an army which fought for the independence of China. Okay, when you say independence, this was the army which was formed by Mao in his long march, right, and the Great Retreat, uh, to fight the nationalists. It was part of the Civil War. This was the same army which fought the Japanese to liberate China from the Japanese occupation. Okay, and this was the army which created conditions for the colonial powers to leave China. So the army then was far different, right? Now, once the the People's Republic of China came into being in 1949, the PLA didn't have anything to liberate. So thereafter, from 49 till about 70, till the Vietnam War, they were an army which catered for an expansionist China. Okay, and which protected its homeland in the way it was conceived at that point of time. I'll come to that. The third phase after 72 is the time when the communists realized that that army is no more useful for the next generations, and then they started changing into what it is today through the four modernization program. Right. So that's the first part of the story. Second, when you look at the threat perception and the, historically, the Chinese face threat from Russia, the Soviets. That was the longer border and the more
volatile one,
was active border. And the second threat was from the coast. Okay, Tibet. This part was really never a threat. So this has guided the way the army was deployed and the way you also have to understand the Han heartland is that land which is between the coast and the Great Wall of China. Beyond that was supposed to be not China, right? In fact, if you look to the north of China, entire Mongolia that stretched beyond up to Siberia, were all flatlands. And the threat was from there, from the Mongol hordes. Later, it was from the Soviet mass forces. That changed when USSR collapsed. Okay, and hence the orientation of the PLA also changed accordingly. Now then, the economy. Initially, what you said was right. The PLA was a poor army. It was based on peasants who fought for their rights, who fought with Mao, right, for emancipation and dictatorship of the proletariat, as the communists used to say at that point of time, for their fundamental land and X, Y, Z. Later, as the economy grew, they had to protect that economy. Once they got the independence, they had to protect that homeland. So the PLA changed, and of course, like I said, the expansionist phase was also there. Now, when their economy is booming, this army has a different characteristic altogether. When I say the army, it's PLA Army, Navy, and the Air Force. The whole thing changes. So it is in this context that one has to understand that, right. So when you look at the human wave tactics, we are looking at a China where lives didn't matter much. Population was growing. Families were based on 8 to 10 people, children. Each family, each father and mother had 8 to 10 children. So people could die and people didn't bother. And that was the way, human lives were more like a fodder during the Mao's time. That same philosophy continued in Korea. Mao felt that if the Americans were allowed to occupy Korea, then they would pose a major threat to the east, Manchuria, across the Yalu River. So he put everything. And if you read the Korean War and the Korean campaign, the Americans were, and the American army was organized like any other Western army, more on fire, less on manpower. There were cases where people kept firing till the barrels were red hot and were mowing down Chinese, but Chinese kept coming in human waves. Human wave is nothing but just mass tactics. Just let people go till the other guy is swamped and he's overrun. Okay. The casualties didn't matter. The same tactics were used against us. The Indian army in 62 was still fighting the positional defense.
Yes.
Whereas that didn't matter to the Chinese. They just wanted, it didn't matter how many people died. They tried the same thing in Vietnam. But in Vietnam, the Vietnamese knew how the Chinese would fight. So they gave way. They traded space for time. They gave way, let the Chinese come in till the Chinese were exhausted, and they attacked them back with firepower and they inflicted huge casualties, and those casualties started becoming unacceptable to the Chinese themselves. The Chinese had to yield. It is not that why Vietnamese didn't suffer casualties. Vietnamese also suffered casualties. Vietnamese also went through this phase of huge losses, manpower losses, but they understood the Chinese way of fighting better. So this is how. Thereafter, Deng Xiaoping, when he came to power post 72 and after Mao's death, right, and then the opening up of the economy took place and the economy started booming, he saw that this army was not fit for a modern state. So one of the four modernizations, the first of the four modernizations which Deng Xiaoping started early in the 90s, was the army. And this was the time when the Soviet Union collapsed and the threat to the north vanished completely. I mean, when I say completely, very marginal threat from Russia. So you had this huge army, which was in state, which would guarantee the communist power in China, but we didn't have a real external threat because India was not a threat, Russia was not a threat. Their one flank was secured in North Korea. It was only the coastal threat. And by then, the colonialism had collapsed, and America was making amends with them and friends with them, and the whole thing's changed. That was also the time when they came back with this idea that rejuvenation and all that were all hidden agendas which are now coming out. One China, where you at one point of time they had a greater China concept where one China was Taiwan, Macau, Hong Kong. You take all this back, put your islands up to the 9-dash line, and look at a greater China which composes of Chinese beyond this line in other areas. So you see that the PLA then said, look, if we're going to become rich, and if we're going to have this thing, we need to have a modern PLA. Outbound PLA, which catered for their expansionist desires and it catered for the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and the Chinese dream. And then you are, ocean faring. And then you had this BRI coming out. So if you have the BRI, that means you need overseas bases, you need to dominate sea lanes. And then the shift happened from the Navy, from the army to the Navy. And then they also found that their army was prehistoric. Okay. Then the experiences of the Gulf War, they saw that, look, the PLA was no match for the Western armed forces. So then they took a lot of lessons from the Gulf War to organize their army. So you see this change which has happened over time due to many factors. And then they have now evolved into a modern force. I hope it answers the broader question.
Absolutely, yes, sir. Because as a matter of fact, the Gulf War, a lot of people and a lot of people who study the PLA, whatever little reading I've done, everybody says that the Gulf War was the changing moment for the Chinese, and
Yes.
that actually kind of brings me to the next question. That the Chinese war strategies have been ever evolving, and they seem to be very proud of their new strategies that they come out with. They write white papers and they put it out into the world for the world to analyze. Um, so they're not as secretive about their strategies as we would think they would be. How do they conceptualize these strategies? Gulf War was one part of it, and what is their main goal?
See, two things have guided their strategy. One, they found that in the Gulf War, there's no point having a mass army. It was more important to have a networked army which was smart, which was informatized, based on intelligence. And they found that the shock and awe of firepower, which
Americans.
you know, the coalition forces used, absolutely paralyzed the, you know, Iraqis twice over, to the point that all the masses were just dislocated and were rendered useless. In the Gulf War, this happened in Kosovo also.
Yes.
So, right, they hit the communication centers, they rendered everyone immobile, they destroyed communications, transport links, and everything. And they made the Iraqis just surrender, useless. This thinking has guided PLA to a large extent, right? Then they knew that they had to. So you'll see the strategies of informatization, reliance on firepower, reliance on mechanization, reliance on advanced weapon systems, reliance on weapon technologies. So, okay, so that is one part of the strategy. Now, other part of the strategy is, look, like I said in the beginning, there's a private army almost, the army of a party. The first task of this army is to keep the party in power. So there's a whole lot of internal commitment. So the strategy took for internal, handling of the state, and keep the CCP in power. Second part of the story is how to get hold of Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, if they have to fight, and these islands. And then their strategy is based on how do I go become a seafaring nation? How do I dominate the oceans like the Americans have dominated, or the Britishers before that, or for that matter, even the Russians, and how the Russians probably failed to some extent because they couldn't dominate the oceans the way the Westerners did. So these people have, their strategy is based on that. And then, of course, they're guided by the fact that their terrain offers them certain fundamentals that they have to have a strategy. Till such time Taiwan is not with them, they have to defend the mainland. If Taiwan is with them, they have an outbound. They will have an outbound strategy. So there's right, and the first island chain is something if till the time they get the first island chain, mainland China is vulnerable. Okay, and as China has become rich and it has now taken up issues with most, they have issues already with Japan, now with USA, so they still remain vulnerable, right? So that strategy is like that. And now that they've picked up a fight back with India, their strategy has changed. Till recently, till around the time when we did uh, signed the border tranquility and peace accord, after we recognized Tibet and they recognized Sikkim, and that whole border became quiet. They didn't have any orientation towards the Tibet border. Now, yeah, the LAC with India has become live again. So the strategy is changing. The strategy will again change when, as till such time, Afghanistan is volatile, right? So that's an open border. So strategies will change with the geopolitical conditions, and now with the geopolitical conditions, your terrain conditions change. Where are you going to fight? So their strategies have changed. And now they're forming and reforming the army accordingly.
I think that's a very interesting point you mentioned, that their strategy kind of changed when they tried to push India. So that just tells you that this to them was a short-term affair. They didn't want it to kind of drag on the way it is going on, and they're kind of developing themselves as we go on in the entire um, standoff conflict, or whatever you may want to term it
Let
as.
me put this in context. When they came, they probably came with the idea that they'll give us a rap on the knuckles and keep those little areas and say, okay, that's it. We've taught you a lesson. We'll go back. But that didn't happen. The spin went in different directions. We have discussed about it. I'll not get back into that.
Yes, yes,
Now they're saying that they're worried. You rebalanced, and now they're worried that they could lose territory. It's not how much you lose territory. Even if they lose a little territory, their credibility is gone in homeland and their power could go. Which means they have to defend this border. Now, so far, they never thought of defending this border. Now they have to defend this border. That means the strategy has changed. The threat to Xinjiang has increased with
yes.
the Taliban and Taliban themselves are in problems with ISK today. As per today's report, the IS presence all over Afghanistan is increasing. So that's going to be a call. And that open thing will flow because that is a non-kinetic affair where ideas flow and ideas don't need corridors and borders.
Like the virus.
Yeah. So if that is thing, so they have to change. They have to now create a CI force.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's so they have to change their strategy. And now, of course, they're back. AUKUS. AUKUS has come in. They've changed the threat to China has changed completely. So they have to do something else to offset that threat. Now they're facing three different threats actually. One is that threat from Islamic radicalism, the conventional threat in high altitude from India, and naval threat from the AUKUS and the Western Alliance. Right? It's not a threat as much as they are being denied getting hold of Taiwan easily. So these three are guiding their thing, and plus, then they have this offensive thing that they want to get hold of Taiwan. They want to dominate the open oceans. They have to protect their overseas assets. They've established a base at Djibouti. They're hoping for a base at Gwadar. So their whole system is now changing. They are in great motion.
Exactly. So you said the threats, and I'd like to kind of take this a little forward by talking about their threat perceptions. You mentioned the maritime threat coming in. You mentioned another threat from India. They probably have a little bit of nervousness from Russia as well, because that's one of the reasons why they keep almost 150 fighter aircraft in close to the borders with Russia, and some of their best aircraft actually are positioned against Russia there. So there is a certain threat from that side. There are threats from Japan, however small it may be. Afghanistan, as you mentioned. So, what are their threat perception? How are they able to balance successfully and unsuccessfully, totally open to interpretation? The question of technology as well as adaptability to the needs of this particular threat. Because as you were saying that the threats to China are ever evolving, is going to put a huge drain, as it did to the Soviet Union as well, trying to protect itself from all directions while it's being belligerent. Are finally, are they able to fast enough catch up with whatever they are doing in terms of technology and so on and so forth to match the changing threat perceptions?
See, you look at it before COVID and before 2000 till 2019. Their threat was far less. They didn't have India threat. They didn't have a threat in Xinjiang from Taliban or Islamic extremism. This was non-existent, right? The Russian threat was also non-existent virtually. Their threat, if any, was along the coast. It was also not much. There was really no threat to the homeland. So their complete strategy was offensive in nature or outbound in nature. Go out. That's all the BRI is all about. You see the 2019 white paper, that's what it tells you. Overseas assets, getting hold of Taiwan, getting hold of the first silent chain, establishing bases outside. So they prepared for open ocean domination and they said, look, let's have a very strong navy. Now, having gone that, and they said the experiences of like Gulf War and the Western experiences taught them that they had to become modern in terms of having modern weapon systems, precision weapon system, rely on long range firepower, rely on informatization, that whole thing. Another major thing which they learned, this business of local war versus, general war, a protracted war.
Yes.
They realized somewhere after Vietnam and, in that area, in that era, that look, war is not going to be fought in a protracted manner. Wars are going to be short for local things and once you finish that, you get out of war. You don't go for war. So they started having this business of local war as against protracted war of the Second World War variety, large frontiers, go on for years, and that's gone. So it's local war. Then they started having local wars under modern conditions, local wars under high-tech conditions, local wars under informationalized conditions. Now they're talking of informatized local wars, and then they're looking at intelligentized local wars. That means they've evolved with technology. They want to use technology with the dominance of information and firepower, the networking, space. Then they realize that war in the traditional domains of air, land, and sea, right, are going to be less fought than in other domains. So they expanded to other domains. What are the other domains? The other domains were cyber, the electromagnetic, space, energy,
media,
others.
propaganda, so on and so forth.
Yeah, propaganda. The three-war strategy they came out with: legal, public opinion, and propaganda. Right. So they went into this concept of multidimensional or full dimensional warfare, where war would be fought along many domains. So the strategy has changed accordingly, right? And then, of course, as they became technologically more proficient, they have started getting more and more in technology into the armed forces and making it modern. And now they have set themselves that by 2035, 2027, a fully mechanized force, and 2035, a modern force, and by 2050, they want to be a world-class army. When they say world-class army, the best army in the world. That's their idea. Or the most advanced army in the world. So the strategy is changing accordingly.
Interesting. So it's a ever evolving strategy that they're trying to also, which is what I'm actually wanting to find out. So would they be able to catch up on the ground with the kind of strategic changes that they're doing pretty much every now and again?
That's the big challenge for them, right? Change is something which, of course, we'll have to adapt. Everyone has to adapt for change in life.
True.
But the kind of change which the PLA is going through is very fast, right? And this change is going through. You must understand that the last time they really fought war and they shed blood was in the 70s, Vietnam War. After that, they have not had experience. After that, the only experience they've had is of others. Okay. So they don't have experience. They're relying on someone else's experience and adapting with they've taken to technology like duck takes to water, and they're coming up with certain concepts which are untested and untried. Will it work? We don't know. Right? So that's the first part. How will it work in battle? We still don't know. It's not been tried. If every battlefield has a limit to where it can absorb technology.
Correct.
Beyond that, technology has got no value. Okay. And if you see the recent experience of Americans, where their full spectrum power got defeated by a no spectrum power like Taliban,
with
a regular force, and whatever. right? Ideological force.
True. True.
So that must be putting a lot of questions into the Chinese mind. Okay. So will all this work in war tomorrow? We don't know. But they're going as per their whatever they've conceived, right? And now, like I said, they've got three battlefields to contend. One, the East China Sea and the South China Sea, that battlefield, and the Pacific to dominate the Pacific and the open oceans. One, this new LAC, which they have to defend for what it's worth. And then they've got into something different from what it was before. So
Yeah.
it's interesting to see how they change,
Yes, sir.
right? How they change. They were changing in a conventional manner. Now they have to and they were looking at a multidimensional manner. But I think there are more dimensions to warfare that they have to contend with than they have ever thought of. This is not there in any writing. This is my analysis.
That's an interesting analogy. So I must say, because one thing that you realize that in the past 2 years, they've developed two threats for themselves. Um, they could have just let India be and not spend so much money in running around making airfields and airports and this and that and so on, villages and so on and so forth. And they didn't have to probably create a CI force, which they are doing right now
They
with
have to know.
in the second base in Tajikistan, first base in Tajikistan, the Wakhan corridor, and that entire region, which is
Yeah.
also a high altitude region
Yeah.
the Chinese are not used to.
See, the point is, it's not a threat. They have to contend with three environments today.
Yeah, correct.
In fact, I will say fourth environment is our outbound environment. See, there is another thing. Look at the BRI. Many projects in the BRI have, gone against the local people.
Yeah. Mm.
Once they go against the local people, we discuss this. They got stakes in those projects today through debt and equity swap, which we discussed. They own those projects. If something happens to those projects, they're lost. They're losses to themselves.
True.
Their interest is lost. So they have to protect them also. So you have your the 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 envelope of what they have to contend with has increased than what it was before.
True, sir. And you also, when one can actually mention, when you buy a new phone, it takes you about a week and a half to try and figure out how to open it and lock it. Here are
Yeah, that's
Chinese
one part of
putting
the
in.
story that's one part of the story is there's a ever evolving envelope of threat.
Right.
There's a evolving change due to technology or overuse or underuse of technology, whichever way you want it. And then the third issue is that their demography is changing,
That
which we've
is,
discussed,
I think,
policy and all.
yeah.
And all so this huge change, we will not know till the PLA carries out some action against someone.
As a matter of fact, we would talk about, I mean, just to all the viewers, we would talk about the PLA as a force probably in the next, second or the third part of this series, because this is just something where we want to understand the organization, the culture, and the thought process of the PLA. So the theatre commands, theatre commands is something which is in discussion within India. While actually we've also done a talk about it, we've done two talks about it. I've spoken to some people from the Air Force, yourself, and a lot of people who had pro and cons to mention about this particular move. This comes into discussion every time the CDS kind of puts out a small feeler. I think he does it to get a lot of feedback from the community. Having said that, this is something that the Chinese claim to have done. A lot of experts say that it's copied from the Russian model. Fair enough, whatever it may be. Uh, when we look at it, we saw so many examples of issues that we came up with their ever-changing threat perceptions, their new battlefields that they're coming up with. Do you think they've been able to iron out all those differences and iron out all the issues that they had within their organizational structure to achieve what they were trying to do? And what is the kind of decision-making structure do you see that they have for the commanders on the ground?
We'll come to the decision-making structure a little later. We'll talk about the theatre commands.
Sure.
See, earlier, if you see, before theatre commands came in, their group armies were disposed in a particular manner. Right? And their group armies were disposed in a manner which catered for the threat at that point of time. There were 3 group armies facing the north virtually, Russia, and a couple of group armies facing, Japan. And as Japan, the threat receded, and the naval threat also has receded, and they have changed. And they've said, look, now if we are going to be a world dominating force, we are going to be you want to be a superpower, you have to change the way you operate. And that's how they came on with this theater command concept. Strictly speaking, if you have a look at it, their theaters are internal to China, with the central command holding the pivot. The northern command faces Russia, the western command faces what shall say, the western command faces India and Central Asian
Afghanistan and Central
republics,
Asia.
Afghanistan. The southern command faces the sea, and the eastern command faces Japan and beyond
Korea
that.
and all that.
Okay, because the threat through Korea, if tomorrow North Korea collapses, that's a major threat for them. Let me tell you this. If tomorrow North Korea collapses or there's a reunification of Korea, it changes their thing completely. That's why they want to keep North Korea up. And then the central command is almost a reserve for everyone. And then you see their interest radiating outside. Sooner or later, they have to go into a command configuration. If they become a superpower, or if en route to becoming a superpower, they have to go into command configuration, which these go outbound into the various spheres of the earth. Sooner or later, as the Arctic ice shelves open up, they might have to come up with an Arctic command or something like that. I don't know. One of these commands would be looking after that. Right. And if they go into Russia, Africa and the Indian Ocean and all that, they have to cater for that also. But right now, they are confined within the thing. Right. It is not even what the Russians did. The Russians still had a different command based on their direction. Because Russia is a huge country. China, that way, is not that huge to have 5 commands. These commands get meaning only if they start looking out.
Correct.
Okay. It makes sense for India to have theater commands, because then one theater looks after Pakistan, one after China, and one after the Indian Ocean. Still. But really speaking, theater commands are the way the Americans are disposed. But I think the Chinese, in their conception, they started with this theater command concept. This would be the springboard to what the Americans have at some point of time in future. This is only transitory. Okay. So this is how their theater commands and all that. So what is the next question? Second part of your question in this?
Decision making and the independence of the commanders on the ground, because theater commands have different lines of communication.
Now the point is this: their highest apex body is the Politburo. Okay. Underneath that is the Central Military Commission, which the Central Military Commission has important people headed by Xi Jinping. Okay, and the chiefs and Prime Minister and all that. And then, the theater commanders under them. Okay, Central Military Commission. And then the theater commander is responsible for his theater. But the way they are so, over centralized, I don't think, and the way they're politicized, they're heavily politicized. Remember, one thing about the PLA, never forget the fact that they're politically guided. See, if you see, the national interests and the tasks for the Indian Armed Forces are derived from the Constitution of India. Whereas the tasking of the PLA is from the Communist Party. There's a difference.
Or the president.
China doesn't have a constitution. Huh?
Or the chairman of the Communist Party, yes.
Yeah, or the chairman of the Communist Party. If you see the way they have grown, at every stage, their leader has given military guidance to the PLA, and they have developed accordingly. Mao wanted to fight a people's war.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Deng wanted modernization. Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin started this business of informatization and information and local wars. Xi Jinping is talking of informatized wars and intelligent wars. So the direction has come politically. They fight political battles first.
Hmm.
Okay. So if they have to fight, get political guidance, their control will be, and of course, they have the political commissar who's the second chain of command, alternate chain of command. So they have to have centralized control. So I don't think they can get that kind of leeway at the bottom. In fact, let me put it beforehand. One of the dichotomies which I see in the PLA, when command and control wise, they're informatizing, they're going for cyber, they're going for AI, they're going for multi-domain operations, X, Y, Z. All these demand directive style of command, delegation, more initiative at local level for him to more decisions at local level in war.
Tactical.
Whereas Xi Jinping is doing all this so that he can control everything from behind, so that the battlefield is transparent for him from Beijing. He wants Eastern Ladakh to be transparent from Beijing to control. So there is a dichotomy. How much of so this command and control is centralized, where the requirement is decentralization. How will it work? We don't know.
Yeah, the whole concept of theater
Definitely,
commands. Yeah,
yeah, and also they at some point of time they would be worried that no theater commander should become so strong that he'll challenge the
absolutely.
might of the state. See, if tomorrow the Communist Party collapses, China collapses. So because they don't have a constitution, it could be a civil war. So they will never give any theater commander the kind of leeway which you and I will give to our theater commanders, or for that matter, any democracy will give to any stable democracy will give it to its military commanders.
Hmm. Interesting. I mean that is completely against the whole concept of theater command. So the theater command is
Well,
for the
that's
guy to make
their
decisions.
concept. It's their
Anyways,
concept. Let's see how it works.
congratulations to them, sir. So there are two
Yep.
last. I mean, in my last question, there are two things that I'd like to ask you, which talks about the culture of the organization that we call the PLA AF Ground Forces of the Navy. Conscription is number one. How do they manage it with the kind of demographic problems that they've got? You know, toy soldiers, chocolate soldiers, whole lot of names that have come out for these guys. And the second are the purges that take place within uh, the armed forces. I'm sure that has a trickle down effect in terms of scaring people and connecting with the last answer that you gave, the independence of thought process and command. How do you see this entire thing?
See, conscription is again historic, based on their struggle for
Mm.
independence, what they call independence, rather the civil war, right? So the communists conscripted people, the peasants, to form an army, and that has continued. And they feel that everyone should join the army and carry on. Today, conscription for them is a necessity because of the one-child policy. People are not coming forward to join, so they have to have conscription. It's changed, but they have to have conscription, and they have to live with conscription. Its pluses and minuses. There's no more a volunteer army. Okay. Now, because of the fact that it's a political army and any part of the army can become politically aligned or misaligned, they have to exercise very strict control. Also, you have to understand this is very funny. I wouldn't say funny, but significant also. If you see their white papers, every white paper talks of corruption, getting rid of corruption. That means that
There's a lot.
and earlier the PLA had businesses.
Hmm.
Each PLA commander was independently rich and he was having his own, fiefdom. All that is gone. But still the corruption is there. So that means they are scared of that also. They want to eradicate corruption. If they have to eradicate corruption, if they have to have conscription, they have to have political loyalty, then they have to have centralized control. Absolute political control. That's why the Commissar system has to continue. Right? These are all dichotomies of the PLA. Let me tell you, some people may call it the strength, I call it the weakness. But then we'll talk about this in a different thing. So
Absolutely.
you'll see the purges. You'll see the purges. The purges could be because of corruption or political loyalty. Okay, it has happened. And you'll see people who are unfit also put in chair because of better loyalty, right? So you'll see various hues. There is no one size fits all in that army. That's the way I look at it. So it's a question mark. So you're always left guessing.
That can be a plus and a huge minus as well, sir.
It, huge minus, yes.
I'm quite surprised when you say they had their own this thing, and as a complete joke, I'd like to say, are you trying to tell me they were running the 4G fertilizer company in China?
Yeah, they were doing it. Like just like Pakistan, they were doing it, and it took Xi Jinping and the previous gentleman a lot of hammering down to get the PLA off businesses.
Wow. Okay, I didn't know that. That's something which is a bit of an eye opener too with regards to this thing, and a lot of people might not be very happy about it. A guy who
Yeah,
probably was a major when all this stuff was happening, he would have dreams. Yeah, kabhi I will also grow up and get a business of my own. Suddenly, he doesn't have it.
yeah. You don't have it.
It does create a lot of problems. So, thank you so much. I think this is covered the organization itself. I mean, there's a lot more that we would talk about in the series, and I'm sure a lot more will come out about the organization when we talk about the people, the armament, its adversaries, and so on and so forth. This topic is pretty extensive, and we'll try our best to kind of keep it concise within short bursts of information
Yeah,
for our viewers, so that
yeah. Today we've covered the genesis,
yes,
the political leaning, and broad organization
broad
of what
culture,
they
yes.
are, and their broad metamorphosis, why they've gone the way they have gone. And we'll get into specifics in the next
Yes, sir.
discussion,
So
and
this
we'll
I
see
would
where it
consider
is.
as a preamble to our discussion about
Yeah,
the PLA. It is something that we, again, I'm repeating myself, that we need to learn about, because what we see in the information domain with regards to the PLA, latest new weapons, firing rockets in this thing, and flying. The best one was today that the helicopter flies at 6,000 meters. I mean, for them, it's a big thing. Our guys have been doing it for, I don't know,
look, let me
years.
leave you with one thought. Other day, one of my friends gave me a video about rocket firing.
Mm.
Uh, and said, "So, see, look at the way they're rocket firing." I looked at it, and something caught my eye. I looked at it again, and then I texted back to him. I said, "Look, see this video again. It is one rocket launcher firing two rounds. This photograph taken from 10 different angles and made to seem as if there are multiple rocket launchers firing. That's what they're doing. They're playing on your mind. I'll share it with you. I would like you next time to show this to everyone.
Absolutely. If you share it with me, sir, I'll put it when you're saying this as the
Yeah,
video
we'll do
itself,
it
so
in the next
people do
episode.
realize what we're talking about. A lot. There was another thing, anecdote that somebody mentioned, that that warship that they're making is very good. It's beautiful. What is there inside? Do the weapons actually work, or is just the shell?
We'll
So
see. It's a lot of it is.
innuendos. Huh?
See, the challenge for most of us is to see through this haze.
Yes,
That's a challenge for our commanders. That's a challenge for our intelligences, and we have to live to this challenge because the day you can get hold of this challenge, let me tell you, you can defeat them.
absolutely agree, sir. And on that note, till next time, sir. Jai Hind.
Jai Hind.